Ukraine and Russia set to begin another round of peace talks in Turkey, with signs that President Zelensky is willing to compromise.
Russia has called US President Joe Biden's comments on Russian leader Vladimir Putin alarming. Mr Biden called Mr Putin a butcher, saying he cannot remain in power. But the White House has scrambled to clarify that Mr Biden is not seeking regime change. European nations have tried to distance themselves from Mr Biden's remarks. Rosie Birch joins us live from Brussels with more. Rosie, what have EU countries said about Mr Biden's comments?
Well, I think the most overt criticism, or the thing closest to criticism that we've heard so far, is from French President Emmanuel Macron. When he was asked in an interview over the weekend about President Biden's comments that President Putin was a butcher, that's how President Biden described him, President Macron says he would not use that kind of language. He said that Western powers should not be in escalation mode, neither through words nor through deeds. Now, the European Union has not been willing to overtly criticise US President Joe Biden, but it has said very clearly that it is not seeking a policy of regime change. It says regime change is something that would be up to the Russian people and the Russian people only. Now, all of this, of course, comes after a big display of transatlantic unity here in Brussels. Joe Biden was here just a few days ago. There was a new US-EU energy partnership announced. So while European leaders might be raising eyebrows among some of them, they're very unlikely to be kind of overtly criticising Joe Biden. They really want to portray this image of transatlantic unity as this conflict in Ukraine rages on.
Meanwhile, EU interior ministers meeting in Brussels to discuss the Ukraine refugee crisis. More than a month of this war, we're looking at about 4 million fleeing the country. What can we expect from these talks?
Ministers are locked in talks as we speak. Now, earlier this month, the European Union took the unprecedented move to offer all those Ukrainians fleeing the conflict temporary protection. That meant access to education, access to the job market, access to healthcare. What ministers are trying to do today is really kind of flesh out the details and enhance coordination to make that vision a reality. We know they might be looking at measures to try and clamp down on the risks of human trafficking. Of course, the majority of those fleeing are women and children. And we also know they're looking into increasing financial support for those EU members that are hosting the most refugees, those that share borders with Ukraine, namely Poland, Hungary, Romania and Slovakia. But there's one name that's not on that list, that's Moldova. It's not a member of the European Union and it's one of Europe's poorest countries. It also shares a border with Ukraine, so EU members today are likely going to be discussing how to better support Moldova as those people continue to flee this deadly conflict.
Rosie, just ahead of peace talks in Turkey, Ukraine says it's willing to give up efforts to join NATO with conditions. Well, given that there have been questions in the last few years about NATO's open door policy, would this kind of signal from Ukraine have any impact on expansion in the future in Ukraine, in NATO?
Well, I think this news, this reinforcement of that message that Ukraine might be willing to compromise on its ambitions toward joining the NATO defensive alliance, that's really bigger news for Ukraine than it is for NATO. That's because NATO allies have long insisted they would not compromise on their open door policy. That means Ukraine's right to apply for membership of the alliance. But there was by no means a guarantee that Ukraine would be welcomed into the folds of NATO. In fact, Ukraine was, by most analysts' estimate, not on the cusp of joining the NATO defensive alliance. And that's why some analysts really questioned Russia's demands when it said that Ukraine being barred from ever joining NATO was one of its key demands when the military build-up was happening and before the invasion actually took place. So really a bigger move for Ukraine than it is for NATO. But of course, NATO is unlikely to stop expanding full stop. We know that those countries, Sweden and Finland, that are not members of NATO, a public debate has now started there on the potential NATO membership for the future. And that's been largely prompted by this war and renewed concerns about security.
And thanks for that, Rosie Birch, speaking to us there from Brussels.